April 27th, 1945. Bavarian forest, 12 kilometers southeast of Munich. The clearing smelled of wet pine and sickness, a smell Corporal James Sullivan would never forget. 3 elderly women lay on crude shelters made from branches and torn blankets, their breathing shallow, their skin the color of ash. The war was ending. Everyone knew it. But here in this forgotten pocket of forest, dying was still dying. Sullivan knelt beside the first woman and felt her forehead, burning hot despite the morning chill. Pneumonia advanced, untreated. Her eyes opened briefly, confused, terrified. Behind him, Sergeant Marcus Washington was already checking the other 2, both critical. Both hours, maybe minutes, from death. And then the question that would define everything that followed. What do we do with enemy civilians who've been left to die by their own people? Before we go further, if you're finding value in these untold stories of humanity during war's darkest hours, hit that like button and subscribe so you never miss another piece of history that deserves to be remembered. Drop a comment below telling us where you're watching from. We love seeing this community grow across the globe. Now, back to that Bavarian forest where 6 American medics stood at a crossroads between orders and conscience. The women were grandmothers. That much was clear from their faces, lined with decades of life that had led to this moment of abandonment. Fra Bergman, the only one still conscious enough to speak, told Private Danny Chun in broken whispers what had happened. German forces retreating ahead of the American advance had swept through their village 3 days earlier. They'd taken everyone who could walk, everyone who could work, everyone who wouldn't slow them down. The elderly, the sick, those who couldn't keep pace with the fleeing army. They were herded to this clearing and left. No food, no medicine, just a promise that someone would come. The German soldiers hadn't said who. Sullivan looked at the 3 women and understood what that promise had really meant. Die quietly where you won't be our problem anymore. And in that moment, Sullivan realized they weren't looking at enemy combatants or Nazi supporters, or any of the abstractions that made war possible. They were looking at 3 human beings who had been discarded like broken equipment. The choice ahead wasn't about military doctrine or strategic priorities. It was about whether mercy was something you extended only to allies, or whether it was something that defined who you were, regardless of the uniform your enemy wore. The 45th Infantry Division had been fighting across Europe for 2 years. Sullivan's medical detachment had treated wounds from Salerno to southern France, from the Vosges Mountains to the Rhine crossing. They'd seen enough death to fill lifetimes, enough suffering to break spirits that had started the war believing in clear moral lines and heroic narratives. By April 1945, those narratives had been ground down to something simpler. Keep your men alive, follow orders, survive until it's over. The war in Europe was in its final weeks. Everyone could feel it in the way German resistance was collapsing, in the way units surrendered en masse rather than fight to the death, in the desperate chaos of a regime that had lost everything but hadn't yet admitted defeat. The 45th had been tasked with pushing through Bavaria, securing territory, processing prisoners and displaced persons, maintaining order in the dissolution. Sullivan's detachment followed the advance, treating wounded, triaging casualties, providing medical support for a machine that consumed bodies and kept grinding forward. They'd stumbled on the clearing by accident, taking a forest road to avoid refugee traffic on the main route. It wasn't on any map. It wasn't marked as a POW camp or a civilian collection point. Just a clearing where 3 women had been left to die in a forest that didn't care whether they were German or American or anything else. Sergeant Washington had 23 years of life behind him and enough medical experience to know these women wouldn't survive another night without intervention. He'd grown up in Tennessee, had become a medic because he wanted to save lives rather than take them, and had learned the hard way that war made that distinction meaningless most of the time. Now he stood in a clearing looking at 3 dying women and calculating the cost of mercy. The nearest field hospital with adequate supplies was 12 miles back the way they'd come. 12 miles of rough terrain, mountain roads, forest paths that barely qualified as roads. 12 miles carrying patients who might die before they arrived. The doctrine was clear. Process civilians, send them to displaced persons camps, let the military government handle complications. But doctrine assumed people who could walk. These women couldn't stand, couldn't move under their own power, couldn't survive transport to a DP camp even if one had been close. Washington looked at Sullivan, then at the other medics. Private Tommy Walsh from Iowa, who'd been a carpenter and knew how to build things that didn't break. Private Rodriguez from Texas, who'd joined the Army the day after Pearl Harbor and had somehow survived 3 years of combat. Danny Chun, whose parents had immigrated from China and who'd learned German in college before the war, made him a translator. All of them exhausted. All of them ready to be done with this war. All of them staring at 3 women who represented everything they'd been fighting against for 2 years. Walsh broke the silence. "We can't leave them." Sullivan nodded. Rodriguez crossed himself. Washington ran back through the forest to Lieutenant Morrison, 24, 6 months in command, still carrying Belgium's shadow. He listened in silence, weighing orders against conscience. Finally he spoke. "Show me." Lieutenant Thomas Morrison stood in the clearing and did the calculation that every combat officer learned to do. Resources versus need. Orders versus reality. The mission assigned versus the mission discovered. His unit's orders were to advance forward, support the division's push, stay en route, maintain operational tempo. Deviating to evacuate 3 elderly German civilians wasn't in those orders. Would take hours, maybe a full day. Would pull his detachment off their assigned path and make command very, very unhappy. Morrison looked at Frau Bergmann, conscious and watching him with eyes that held no hope, just the exhausted acceptance of someone who'd already been abandoned once. He looked at Frau Keller and Frau Schmidt, barely breathing, barely alive, held to existence by the thinnest of threads. He thought about his mother back in Pennsylvania, about his grandmother who'd raised him after his father died, about the letters home where he'd tried to explain what the war was teaching him about human nature. He thought about the propaganda they'd all been fed about the evil enemy, about the need to hate, about the moral clarity that made killing possible. And then he thought about what it would mean to walk away from 3 dying women because helping them wasn't efficient, wasn't strategic, wasn't what command expected. "We're taking them to the aid station," Morrison said. Washington nodded. Sullivan let out a breath he hadn't known he was holding. Walsh started calculating what materials they'd need for stretchers. Morrison radioed command and reported 3 critical civilian patients with advanced pneumonia, requesting immediate evacuation. The reply came fast. Negative on deviation. Advance forward. Civilian casualties were secondary. Morrison looked at his men, at the 3 women, and at the choice before him. He keyed the radio once more. "Respectfully, we cannot leave critical patients to die. We are proceeding with evacuation. Morrison out." He shut the radio off. The silence afterward said everything. He had defied orders in wartime, choosing humanitarian duty over discipline, risking court-martial and his career for 3 elderly enemy civilians. Sullivan noticed Morrison's hands tremble as he holstered the radio. Then Morrison spoke calmly. "Let's make stretchers. We're burning daylight." Walsh cut pine branches and lashed them into crude but sturdy frames. Each stretcher took 30 minutes. Sullivan stabilized the women as best he could, sulfa drugs, blankets, water in careful sips. Frau Bergman asked Chun why they were helping. "Because you're sick," he said. "Because leaving you would make us no better than those who did." She wept, speaking of a grandson fighting somewhere in the east. "I hope he's safe," Chun replied. "I hope someone shows him mercy, too." By noon, the stretchers were ready. Morrison assigned pairs, set rotations, and outlined the march to the aid station. 6 American medics lifted 3 dying German women and began the long walk back. The first hour taught them what 12 miles really meant. The stretcher poles bit into shoulders, not built for sustained weight. Sullivan felt sweat soak his uniform despite the April chill as he matched Morrison's pace, keeping Frau Keller level. She was unconscious, her breathing wet and labored, each breath sounding final. The forest path was slick with roots, rocks, and mud. Every step required care. Behind them, Washington and Walsh carried Frau Schmidt in silence. Chun and Rodriguez followed with Frau Bergman, conscious enough to whisper prayers in German. The only sounds were breathing, footfalls, and warnings about obstacles. After 15 minutes, Sullivan's shoulders ached. By 45, the pain was constant. At the hour mark, Morrison called halt. Sullivan set down the stretcher and felt his shoulders scream. They rotated. Walsh took Frau Keller. Sullivan helped with Frau Schmidt, while Chun checked conditions. Frau Keller was worse, rapid, shallow breaths, gray skin. Sullivan administered sulfa and checked her pulse. Fast, weak. She might not survive another hour, but leaving her meant certain death. They continued, Sullivan now scouting ahead, searching for the least punishing path. The second hour was harder. Determination gave way to exhaustion. Morrison's shoulders bled beneath his jacket. Washington moved with grim precision. Welsh listened to Frau Bergman's whispered prayers. Chun later translated, prayers for her grandson for the war's end, for mercy shown by men who had nothing to gain. At 2 hours they reached the jeep. Morrison radioed in. Command ordered him to cease evacuation and return immediately. Morrison replied calmly that abandoning the patients meant death and that he accepted full responsibility. The radio went silent. They continued. The third hour marked halfway. 6 miles down, 6 to go. Shoulders were raw, nerves numb. Sullivan rotated back to Frau Keller with Chun. He felt the terrible responsibility of keeping her alive. His shoulders were beyond pain, but she was breathing. That mattered. Walsh clenched his jaw against agony. Rodriguez sang softly in Spanish to keep rhythm. Morrison led from the front, blood soaking his jacket, refusing to slow. If he stopped, they all would, and stopping meant death. At the 4th hour, Chun called an emergency halt. Frau Keller had stopped breathing. Sullivan ran to her head, cleared her airway, began rescue breaths. Washington started compressions. Minutes passed, arms burned. Lungs ached. Then a gasp, weak, uneven, but real. Her heart staggered back. They gave morphine, lifted the stretchers, and moved faster. Time was running out, and this might be their only chance. The fifth hour was pure willpower overriding physical collapse. Sullivan's shoulders had moved beyond numbness into something that felt like his arms were separating from his body. He could feel blood soaking his undershirt where skin had torn completely. Could feel his legs shaking with each step, muscles pushed past their limits, held together by determination and the knowledge that stopping meant failure. But Frau Keller was breathing. That single fact mattered more than pain, more than exhaustion, more than the voice in his head screaming to put down the stretcher and rest. She was alive because he was carrying her, because Washington had restarted her heart, because Morrison had chosen mercy over orders. Behind him, the other men fought their own battles with failing bodies. Walsh's hands were cramping on the stretcher poles, fingers locked in position by muscle spasms. Washington's breathing was labored, each inhalation requiring conscious effort. Rodriguez had stopped singing, needed all his energy just to keep moving. Chun's legs were trembling visibly, his young body pushed further than training had prepared him for. And Morrison leading from the front, despite shoulders that were destroyed, despite back spasms that made him want to scream, despite knowing that every step was costing him pieces of himself he might never get back. The sixth hour brought them within sight of Forward Aid Station Baker, tents clustered around a farmhouse, vehicles parked in organized chaos, smoke rising from medical incinerators. The organized efficiency of military medicine visible even from distance. Morrison radioed ahead with the last of his strength. 3 critical civilian patients, advanced pneumonia, require immediate intensive care. ATA 15 minutes. The response came from Major Hawkins, the station's commanding physician. We're ready. Bring them straight to the main tent. Those words gave Sullivan energy he didn't know he still had. 15 more minutes. 4 stretcher pole changes. One final push through terrain that seemed determined to kill them all. The final mile was the longest of Sullivan's life. His world narrowed to the trail, the stretcher pole on his shoulder, and the woman whose life depended on him staying upright for 15 more minutes. Training carried him when his body had nothing left. He remembered nothing the last half mile. His first clear memory was sitting on the ground, unable to stand, as doctors and nurses swarmed the 3 women. 6 American medics had carried 3 dying German women 12 miles through Bavarian mountains in 8 hours. They had defied direct orders, chosen mercy when doctrine said to walk away. Now the question was no longer whether the women would live, but what the cost of that choice would be. Major Hawkins took control immediately, issuing orders for oxygen, 4 fluids, and penicillin. The new drug attacked Frau Keller's pneumonia with near-miraculous speed. Oxygen steadied damaged lungs. Within minutes, death was no longer imminent. Hawkins turned to Lieutenant Morrison, noting his bloodied jacket and exhausted stance. "Who authorized this evacuation?" "I did, against orders." "And your new command wanted them left?" "Yes, sir." "They were abandoned, sick and helpless. And you decided that wasn't acceptable." "It wasn't. Leaving them would have made us no better than those who left them." Hawkins nodded. "You'll face consequences." Colonel Henderson is furious. "Off the record, you did the right thing. These women would be dead without you." Then quietly, "On the record I must report insubordination." Sullivan watched the women breathe. Frau Keller stabilized. Frau Schmidt regained consciousness. Frau Bergman cried as Chun translated reassurance. The pain in Sullivan's ruined shoulders didn't matter. They were alive. Washington discovered his shoulders torn raw. Walsh's hands had to be massaged open. Rodriguez collapsed for 20 minutes. Frau Bergman kept asking Chun the same question. "Why did you help us?" Chun answered simply, "Because you needed help, and mercy isn't reserved for allies." All 3 women survived. Keller's fever broke within 2 days. Schmidt recovered quickly. Bergman healed physically, but struggled to understand mercy from enemies. Morrison received a formal reprimand. Henderson told him discipline mattered, but quietly admitted he would have made the same choice. The story spread. Some called it foolish. Others called it proof that humanity could survive war. The facts remained. 3 women lived because mercy was chosen. Before her transfer, Frau Keller thanked the unit. "You carried us when our own would not. We will tell the truth that decency still exists, even in war." The unit returned to duty. The war ended 3 weeks later. The men carried home many memories, but none heavier than the stretchers they bore through 12 miles of forest, choosing humanity when it mattered most. 40 years later, in 1985, James Sullivan received a letter from Germany. It had traveled through veterans groups and military records to find the medic who once carried an elderly woman to safety. The letter came from Frau Keller's granddaughter. Her grandmother had survived the war, returned home, lived another 30 years, and died peacefully among family. Before her death, she told the story again and again of American soldiers who defied orders, of mercy shown when none was required. "My grandmother never forgot," the granddaughter wrote. "She taught us that hatred is a choice, that enemies can become saviors. Because you carried her instead of leaving her to die, our family exists. Your mercy multiplied across generations." Sullivan read the letter in his Iowa living room and wept for the woman he'd carried, for the war that forced such choices, and for the grace of knowing one decision had echoed through decades. He wrote back that he'd only done what felt right, that the real heroes were the women who survived, and that he hoped Germany had become something better. Letters followed for years, crossing the Atlantic and binding former enemies through a single act of compassion. Marcus Washington kept a photograph from the aid station, the medics standing with the 3 German women they'd saved, all exhausted but alive. Framed in his Tennessee home, it became the story he told his grandchildren, not of battles, but of choosing humanity over hatred. Thomas Morrison's record listed a reprimand for insubordination beside his medals. When asked, he explained he'd disobeyed orders to save dying women and would do it again. Historians later cited the incident as an example of mercy amid occupation, but for the men it was simpler. They found 3 dying women. They could help. So they did. 12 miles through a Bavarian forest, 8 hours of carrying, 3 lives saved. A small moment in a vast war, but one that proved mercy, even toward enemies, is the truest measure of human worth.